On a cold night in December 1773, a crowd of men in Boston went aboard 3 ships tied up at Griffin's Wharf and destroyed 46 tons of tea. And the tea they threw into the harbor that night was the cheapest tea that had ever been offered for sale in America. Not the most expensive, the cheapest. A pound of it, landed and duty paid and sitting legally on a Boston counter, would have undercut every chest of tea in the town. Here is the ground we are going to cover tonight. What a pound of tea actually cost in Boston before that night, and what it was about to cost. Who was making money on the old price, and what those men stood to lose on the new one. What was inside the 342 chests, what the East India Company said they were worth, and what Britain then charged the town of Boston for them. This is not the story of a tax rise. There was no tax rise that year. That is the part of it that got lost somewhere between the harbor and the school book, and it is the part that makes the whole thing make sense. Start with the duty, because everybody remembers there was one. In 1767, Parliament passed what were called the Townshend duties, after Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer who drew them up. They put a charge on glass, on lead, on paint, on paper, and on tea coming into the American colonies. The colonies refused to buy. Merchants signed agreements not to import. 3 years later, in 1770, Parliament gave way and repealed almost all of it. The glass duty went. The lead duty went. The paint and the paper went. One duty was left standing, and it was the one on tea, threepence on every pound weight. Threepence is the whole quarrel, so it is worth being clear about what threepence was. It was not a crushing sum. Tea in Boston sold for something in the region of 2 or 3 shillings a pound, and there are 12 pence in a shilling, so the duty was somewhere around 1 part in 10 of the price. The government knew perfectly well that it would not pay for anything. Lord North, who was the Prime Minister by then, was open about why he kept it. The duty stayed not because the Treasury needed the money, but because taking it away would have looked like Parliament admitting it had no right to tax America at all. It was kept as a marker, a flag planted in a teapot. Now the part that is usually left out. Most of the tea Americans were actually drinking in 1773 had never paid that threepence, or any other duty, because it had never legally entered the country. It came from the Netherlands, run into the coves and inlets of New England and New York by colonial merchants in colonial ships, and by the best estimates historians can make, it was something like 3/4 of everything in the pot. The boycott had not made America give up tea. It had made America give up British tea. And in doing so, it had built an entire smuggling economy, with warehouses and captains and credit lines, and a great many respectable men at the top of it. John Hancock, the richest merchant in Boston and the man whose signature you can read from across a room, was one of the names in that trade. So here is the question this whole story comes down to, and put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. Nobody in Boston was about to pay more for tea. The price was going down, not up. So was the destruction of the tea a protest about liberty or a protest about profit? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. To understand why the price was going down, you have to leave Boston entirely and go to a warehouse on the Thames, because the East India Company was in very serious trouble. This was not a tea shop. It was a corporation with an army, which had taken control of the revenues of Bengal and was governing something in the order of 20 million people, while paying a dividend to shareholders in London. In 1770, a famine in Bengal killed an enormous number of those people and collapsed the revenue the company had been counting on. 2 years later, a credit crisis in London closed banks in England and Scotland and left the company unable to raise short-term money. It was, in plain terms, going bust. and it was going bust while sitting on tea. The company's London warehouses held something in the region of £17 million weight of unsold tea. It had bought that tea, it owed money on that tea, and it could not sell it, partly because the American market it had counted on was being supplied by Dutch smugglers instead. A company that governed a subcontinent came to Parliament asking for a loan, and Parliament, which had no intention of letting it fail, looked for a way to turn the warehouses into cash. The answer was the Tea Act, passed in May of 1773, and it is worth reading it for what it actually did rather than what it is remembered for doing. It did not raise the threepence. It did not add a new charge of any kind. What it did was let the East India Company ship tea straight from its warehouses to America, without first selling it at auction in London, and without paying the heavy English inland duty, which would now be refunded on anything sent across the Atlantic. That refund was worth far more than threepence a pound. Strip it out, and legal company tea arriving in Boston could be sold at a price the Dutch smugglers could not match. Read that sentence again, because it is the hinge of the whole thing. Parliament had just made it cheaper to buy the taxed tea than the untaxed tea. For the first time since the Townshend duties, the law-abiding customer was going to get the better price. A colonial housewife buying a pound of tea in 1774 would have paid less for it than her sister paid in 1773, and she would have paid a duty she had not paid before, and both of those things are true at the same time. The Act did one other thing, and this is where the trouble actually starts. It gave the company the right to appoint its own agents in each American port to receive and sell the tea, instead of putting it through the ordinary colonial merchants. Those agents were called consignees, and they were going to get the commission on every chest. In Philadelphia and New York and Charleston, that meant a handful of favored firms. In Boston, it meant something considerably harder to swallow. Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, was a Boston man, born there, a serious historian of his own colony and the most hated official in it. When the company's Boston consignments were handed out, two of the names on the list were Thomas Hutchinson Jr. and Elisha Hutchinson, the governor's sons. Alongside them stood Richard Clark and Sons and Benjamin Fanuel, all of them well connected to the governor's circle. So the arrangement that reached Boston was this. A single London corporation would now supply the town's tea, at a price no local merchant could compete with, through agents who included the governor's own children, and every pound of it would carry a duty that Parliament had specifically kept in place to prove it could tax you. Hutchinson had a reason for standing firm that had nothing to do with tea, and it is the reason he is the pivot of this story rather than a bystander. 8 years earlier, in the summer of 1765, a Boston crowd angry about the Stamp Act had come to his house on Garden Court Street and taken it to pieces. They went through the doors with axes, emptied the rooms, drank the cellar dry, pulled the slates off the roof, and scattered into the street the manuscripts and papers he had been collecting for 30 years towards his history of Massachusetts. He was not even the man who had brought in the Stamp Act. He had privately argued against it. He rebuilt, he was compensated by the colony, and he never forgot a minute of it. So when a Boston meeting told him in December of 1773 to let a ship sail away, the governor of Massachusetts was being asked to give way to a crowd for the second time in his life, and he had decided a very long time before that there would not be a second time. You did not have to be a smuggler to find that arrangement alarming, and this is the thing that gets missed when people say it was really only about money. Both things were true at once. The men whose fortunes ran on Dutch tea were about to be undercut out of the business by a state-backed monopoly. And the men who had spent 6 years arguing about the principle of taxation were being handed the neatest possible demonstration of what a monopoly plus a duty looks like when it arrives at your own wharf. The Tea Act managed to threaten the merchants' balance sheets and confirm the radicals' argument in the same paragraph. 3 other American ports worked out how to deal with the ships without anybody destroying anything. In Philadelphia and in New York, the pressure on the consignees was so total that they resigned before the tea arrived. And when the ships came in, they were turned around and sent back to England with the cargo still in the hold. In Charleston, the tea was landed, but nobody would buy it and nobody would claim it. So customs took it, and it sat in a damp cellar under the exchange until it was worthless. 3 ports, 3 different answers, no violence and no consequences. The difference in Boston was that the consignees would not resign, because 2 of them answered to a father who would not let them, and because a governor who had spent his career being told what to do by Boston crowds had decided this was the moment he stopped giving way. The first ship reached Boston on the 28th of November, 1773. She was the Dartmouth, a whaling vessel belonging to the Rotch family of Nantucket, who were Quakers and merchants and had no interest whatever in politics. Her cargo included 114 chests of tea. Within days, the Aliner came in, and then, delayed by a smallpox quarantine, the Beaver. A 4th ship carrying tea, the William, never made Boston at all. She ran aground on the back of Cape Cod in a December gale and broke up there. The men who managed the Dartmouth in Boston did so through Francis Rotch, who was in his 20s and who spent the next 19 days being the most trapped man in Massachusetts. Because the moment a ship entered the harbor and reported her cargo, a clock started running, and that clock is the entire mechanism of what followed. The law said this: duty on an imported cargo had to be paid within 20 days of the ship's arrival. If it was not paid, the customs officers were entitled to seize the goods and sell them to recover it. The Dartmouth had arrived on the 28th of November. Her 20 days ran out on the 17th of December. So the town of Boston had a deadline, and everybody in it could count. Think about what that clock does to everyone's options. The town could not simply refuse the tea, because refusing it did not send it away. Doing nothing for 20 days did not keep the tea out of Boston. Doing nothing for 20 days handed the tea to the customs house, which would land it, sell it, collect the threepence on every pound of it, and hand the money to exactly the government the whole argument was with. Inaction was not neutral. Inaction was surrender with extra steps. And there was a further problem inside that deadline which the town understood perfectly well. If the customs officers seized the Dartmouth's cargo on the 18th of December, they would not have burned it. They would have sold it at public auction on the Boston waterfront, and the duty would have been paid out of the proceeds. And the tea would have been bought, not by the consignees necessarily, and not by anybody who wanted to make a political statement, but by shopkeepers who needed stock and by householders who drank tea, because it was cheap and because it was there. 6 years of boycott had held because the alternative was available and roughly the same price. Nobody in Boston was confident it would hold against a bargain. The 20 days were not a countdown to a confrontation. They were a countdown to the moment when the whole argument got settled quietly by people buying things. The other exit was to send the ships home, and that was blocked from the opposite direction. A vessel that had entered the harbor and declared her cargo could not clear out of it again without a pass from the governor. Rotch asked the customs collector for one and was refused. He asked again. He was told that no ship could be cleared while dutiable goods remained on board. And the man who could overrule all of that was Thomas Hutchinson, whose sons were waiting for the commission on the cargo. Meanwhile, the ship sat at Griffin's Wharf under guard, and it was not the governor's guard. Boston mounted its own watch in shifts, 20 25 men at a time, to make certain that nobody quietly landed a chest of tea in the dark and paid the duty on the sly. That is a detail worth holding on to, because it tells you how well everyone understood the stakes. The danger was never that the tea would be forced on them at gunpoint. The danger was that a single chest would come ashore legally, and the principal would be gone. On the 16th of December, the day before the clock ran out, the town met at the Old South Meeting House. Boston at the time had a population somewhere around 16,000. The crowd that packed into Old South and the streets around it that day is put at 5,000 and upwards, which means that a substantial fraction of every man in the region was standing in one place, in the rain, waiting on the answer to one question. Francis Rotch was sent out to Milton, 7 miles off, where Hutchinson was staying at his country house, to ask one last time for a pass to take the Dartmouth and her tea back out to sea. The meeting waited. It was dark by the time Rotch got back, a little before 6 in the evening, and he told them what everybody had expected. The governor would not grant it. He had no legal power to grant it, he said, and he would not have used it if he had. Samuel Adams, who had spent a decade turning Boston's grievances into a political machine, stood up and said the line that ended the meeting. "This meeting," he said, "can do nothing further to save the country." Whether that was a signal or simply a summary has been argued about ever since. What is not in dispute is what happened in the next few minutes. A war whoop went up from the gallery, the crowd began to move, and by the time it reached Griffin's Wharf there were men at the front of it with soot and lampblack on their faces and blankets around them, dressed as nobody in particular but understood by everyone. What happened at the wharf over the following 3 hours was, by every account that survives, one of the most disciplined acts of destruction in the history of protest. The men divided into 3 parties, one for each ship. They asked the captains for the keys to the hatches and the ship's hoists, and got them. They brought the chests up on deck, split them open with axes, and tipped the tea over the side. The water at Griffin's Wharf was shallow at low tide, so the tea piled up in the mud until men had to get down and beat it apart with their oars to stop it drifting back aboard. 342 chests went into Boston Harbor that night, roughly 92,000 pounds weight of tea, which is 46 tons. It took about 3 hours, and when it was done the men swept the decks, put everything back where they found it, and went home. One padlock had been broken getting into a hold, and it belonged to the ship's captain rather than to the company. A replacement was delivered the following day. Nothing else on those ships was touched. There was other cargo aboard and none of it was taken. One man, Charles Connor, was caught trying to stuff loose tea into the lining of his coat, and the others stripped the coat off him and sent him out of the crowd. That is a strange detail to find in a riot, and it is not a riot detail. It is the behavior of men who knew exactly how the night was going to be described afterwards, and were determined that the description should be theirs. It is worth knowing what was actually in those chests, because it was not a luxury cargo. The great bulk of it was bohea, which was the cheapest black tea in the trade, the everyday leaf that ordinary households drank twice a day and that a laborer could afford. Somewhere around 240 of the 342 chests were bohea. The remainder were the better grades, Kungu and Souchong and the green Hyson and Singlo, in far smaller quantities. So the cargo destroyed at Griffin's Wharf was not a shipment of fine tea for rich men's tables. It was the working stock of a whole town's ordinary drinking, priced to undercut anything already on the shelves, and that is precisely why it had to go over the side rather than be left to sit unsold. Charleston could let its tea rot in a cellar because nobody would touch it. Boston's tea, at Boston's new price, would have sold itself. Most of what we know about the inside of that night comes from a shoemaker called George Hughes, who was there, and who was still alive in the 1830s when Americans finally became interested in asking. He was in his 90s by then, and had spent his life poor and unremarked. 2 writers took his account down, and it is because of an old shoemaker's memory that we know about the keys, and the padlock, and the man with the tea in his coat. The morning after, John Adams wrote in his diary what a great many people in Massachusetts were feeling, and rather fewer were prepared to say out loud. This, he wrote, is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. One thing before we go on. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of American financial history every single day. So what had actually been destroyed in money? The East India Company put in a claim, and the figure it arrived at was £9,659 sterling. That is the number the whole imperial crisis then turned on, so it is worth translating. A skilled craftsman in London at the time might earn something in the region of £25 or £30 in a year. On that arithmetic, the tea in Boston Harbor represented roughly 300 working lifetimes worth of a good year's wages, or, put another way, about the annual pay of 300 skilled men. It was a serious sum, and it was not a national catastrophe. It was, to a state that spent millions on its navy, a rounding error with a flag in it. And that is the strange proportion at the center of this story. On one side, a duty of threepence that was never meant to raise revenue. On the other, a cargo worth under £10,000. Between them, an empire and 13 colonies, and every choice made from here on made by men who had stopped counting. London's reaction is best understood as fury at the method rather than the amount. Other ports had refused the tea and nothing had happened to them. New York sent its ship home. Philadelphia sent its ship home. Charleston let the tea rot. None of those towns were punished because none of them had destroyed property. Boston had, and it had done so after a public meeting, in front of thousands of witnesses, and not one person could be found who would name a single participant. That was the part that could not be tolerated, because a government that cannot identify a wrongdoer in a crowd of 5,000 is not governing. Benjamin Franklin, who was in London as the agent for Massachusetts, and who was the closest thing the colonies had to a friend inside the establishment, thought the destruction had been a serious mistake. He wrote that it was an act of violent injustice on the American side, and that the tea ought simply to be paid for. He went further than opinion. In the negotiations that ran through the following winter, he offered to pay for the tea himself, out of his own pocket, if the punishment of Boston were lifted. It came to nothing. By then the price of the tea was not the point to anybody. In March of 1774, Parliament passed the Boston Port Act, and its terms are the reason this is a money story from beginning to end. From the 1st of June, the Port of Boston would be closed. Not taxed, not restricted, closed. No vessel could load or unload anything in it, with narrow exceptions for firewood and food brought in from elsewhere in the colony. And the port would stay closed until 2 conditions were met. The town had to make full compensation to the East India Company for the tea it had destroyed, and the king had to be satisfied that order in Massachusetts was restored. So the bill was presented precisely and in public. Pay us £9,659 and you may have your harbor back. Consider what was being asked for and what was being threatened, side by side. Boston was a port and nothing else. It had no farmland behind it worth the name, no industry that did not depend on ships, and a population that lived on fish, timber, rum, and the carrying trade. Closing the harbor did not find Boston. It switched Boston off. Within weeks there were men on the wharves with no work at all, and the town was running relief committees. The lost trade in a single summer was worth many times the value of the tea, which raises the arithmetic that nobody in the cabinet appears to have done. The company's loss was under £10,000. The cost of the enforcement in a fleet stationed in the harbor, a garrison quartered in the town, and a customs service moved to Salem ran past that inside the first months. Britain was spending more to collect the debt than the debt was worth, and it went on doing so because the debt was not really the point either. Both sides had now moved on to arguing about something with no price on it. The Port Act did not come alone. Alongside it came an act that tore up the Massachusetts Charter and put the colony's council and its sheriffs and its juries under the Crown's appointment rather than the colony's election. Another allowed officials accused of crimes in the colony to be tried in England. Another regularized the quartering of troops. In America, they were called the Intolerable Acts, and the naming is fair because they were designed to be an example. The intention was that every other colony should watch what happened to Boston and decide it did not fancy any of it. Every other colony watched and decided the opposite. That is the miscalculation, and it is worth sitting with because it was not obvious in advance. Boston was not universally liked. It had a reputation for mobs and self-righteousness, and the southern colonies in particular had spent years finding it exhausting. But the Port Act did not read as a punishment for destroying tea. It read as a demonstration that Parliament could switch off any colony's economy by a vote in London, and there was not a merchant from Portsmouth to Savannah who could not imagine his own harbor in the sentence. So the relief convoy started. Rice came up from South Carolina. Connecticut sent sheep, and there is a well-told story of a flock driven up the road to Boston with a crowd walking alongside it. Villages in Massachusetts and Virginia collected money. Feeding Boston became the practical expression of an argument, and the argument now had a committee structure and a supply chain. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, and the First Continental Congress had been convened by the Port Act as surely as if the act had sent out the invitations. They agreed a comprehensive boycott of British trade. They endorsed the resistance in Massachusetts, and they arranged to meet again in the spring if nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. They met again in May of 1775, 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord. Now look back at the ledger, because the ledger is the strangest part of all of it. Parliament kept the tea duty in 1770, against the advice of half the cabinet, purely to make a point, and the duty raised so little that nobody has ever bothered to make a proper argument about the sum. Parliament then passed a Tea Act that lowered the price of tea in America in order to rescue a corporation, and that reduction in price costed Boston. Boston then destroyed a cargo worth under £10,000, and Parliament answered by shutting off its own most valuable American port and stationing an army to make sure it stayed shut. Within 2 years, the whole account was closed by a war that cost Britain over £100 million and lost her the colonies entirely. And the £9,659 was never paid, not in 1774 when Boston refused, not afterwards. The company wrote it off. The bill that shut the harbor of the busiest port in North America, that put a garrison in a town of 16,000 people, and that assembled the Continental Congress by accident, was a bill for a cargo of tea that no household in America ever drank and no shareholder in London was ever compensated for. There is one last thing worth saying about the name. Nobody called it the Boston Tea Party at the time. In the 1770s, and for 50 years afterwards, it was called the destruction of the tea, which is a plain description of what it was. The cheerful name arrives in print in the 1830s, at exactly the moment when the last participants like George Hughes were old men being interviewed as living relics, and a new generation was deciding what the founding of the country was going to feel like in the retelling. A tea party sounds like high spirits. The destruction of the tea sounds like a decision, taken by men who knew what a chest of tea cost and what a harbor was worth, and made it anyway. Which brings us back to where we started. The tea was cheaper. That is not a technicality, and it is not a debunking. It is the fact that makes the night at Griffin's Wharf mean anything, because if the price had gone up, you would need no explanation at all. Men who are being overcharged throw things in the water, and always have. Men who throw the cheap tea in the water are telling you that they have worked out that the price was never what they were being asked to agree to. You can believe both readings of that at once, and I think you probably should. There were men on those decks whose credit lines ran on Dutch tea, and who would have been ruined by illegal cargo at a legal price. There were also men on those decks who did not sell tea, would never sell tea, and who understood exactly what it meant that a duty had been kept alive with no revenue attached to it. It is not a coincidence that the merchant's interest and the argument about liberty pointed the same way that winter. It is what made the thing possible. Principles that cost their holders nothing rarely fill a wharf on a wet December evening. Threepence a pound on a cargo that was going to be sold cheaper than the smuggled alternative. That is what was on the table, and Boston pushed the table into the harbor.